Welcome. My name is PERUKEL, and today I would like to present you my research on the link between party ideology and foreign policy decisions taken by US presidents. This research is conducted by analyzing presidential discourse and the frames used to describe military interventions by American presidents between 1950 and 2009. Ever since the Reagan administration, scholars have focused on the importance of presidential speech. We hope that more in-depth analysis of the discourse of military interventions can demonstrate whether the assumed positions and models regarding this topic will carry relevance in the American political landscape. This project is aimed towards the understanding and analysis of party political cleavages found within multiple public addresses and the overall narrative of US presidents over time. Foreign policy is based upon the interests of the actors who are in a position of power. Therefore, in order to understand the foreign policy decisions that are being taken, we need to know who is taking them. The vocabulary presidents use to characterize enemies, the threats facing the US, and the actions the US should take is important because presidential enemy construction is one of the central components of a president's foreign policy vocabulary, which in turn becomes a guide to understand American foreign policy at large. This can be studied by analyzing the presidential discourse on the subject. Some even describe foreign crises as linguistic constructions, for it is largely through presidential communication that foreign crises become real for American citizens. If we combine the idea of party political cleavages and presidential discourse, we come to the following research question. Can the party identification of a US president be linked to a liberal or realist frame in the discourse on military interventions? Rathbun tries to explain what it means to be on the left or right in terms of foreign policy. Linked to the Democratic Party, the most fundamental liberal presumption is based on the democratic peace theory. Wilson defined this as, a steadfast concert of peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. No autocratic government could be trusted to keep faith within it or observe its covenants. The liberal conviction in the positive effects of proliferation of democracy forms a focal point for the foreign policy of the US in the 20th century. This includes the promotion of international institutions through which the trust between states is enlarged, so that it is easier and more efficient to create international treaties. The left's stress on equality can be seen internationally in the advocacy of human rights, promotion of democracy, and international aid. The point of equality is also noted in the fight of the left trying to rescue the weak against the strong, fighting for the underprivileged. This leads us to our first hypothesis. Democratic presidents use the liberal frame more than the realist frame in the discourse on military interventions. For the Republican Party, the base of the American foreign policy is grounded in the realist belief in which the anarchic world system is built up out of selfish states that have to survive and therefore look after their own self-interest. This research adopts the view in which the realist frame would place the highest importance to the American national safety and interests as the goals of foreign policy, displayed in a pragmatic grand strategy. This strategy is based on the belief that stability and the political character of other states and regions can have an enormous impact on the possibility of the US to ensure its own safety and economic interests. This leads to our second hypothesis. Republican presidents use the realist frame more than the liberal frame in the discourse on military interventions. Frames are the vessels through which party ideology is brought to the public. In order to test our hypotheses, we will look at the wording American presidents between 1950 and 2009 chose to explain and justify their military interventions to the public. We will do so by analyzing the public papers, news conferences, speeches, and fireside chats of these presidents to see what frames they use most of the time when discussing their wars. This way, we can write a string of search words that belong to both the liberal frame and the realist frame and see which one presidents use more often. To answer our research question, we will use a quantitative content analysis. This automatic content analysis is executed with the help of MCAT-3, a program for automatic, semi-automatic, and manual content analyses designed by the scholars of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. We will use MCAT to test how many times a president uses the terms that we would associate with a left or right point of view in his public papers. To determine the words to be included, We base the search strings upon keywords used by left and right-wing parties, as described by several authors. The analysis focuses on the number of times the concepts are used by each president. The associations are analyzed by filtering the datasets on sentences that used at least one of the terms in the frame, which is called parsing. For example, all President Truman's public papers are tested for the terms of the liberal frame. Then we cross-test, searching the public papers of President Truman, a Democrat, for the realist frame. Our hypothesis states he will use this frame less than he will use the liberal frame. Per frame, we calculate how many times that frame is used in comparison with the total number of frames. For example, if Truman speaks of military interventions for a number of 200 times and he uses the liberal frame in 60 instances, this means he uses the liberal frame 30% of the time. The same thing is done for the realist frame, after which we can compare the percentages. On the base of the search strings described in the methods section of this research, a total of 1,663 public papers were selected. After analyzing these papers, several conclusions can be drawn. First, the percentages of the use of frames are fairly consistent and range from 23.5% to 40.5%. Also, we see that there is no overwhelming use of the expected frame over the frame that the president supposedly would not adhere to. Even though some presidents did use their expected frame most of the time, it is apparent that there is no overwhelming support for our hypotheses. 6 out of 10 presidents did not use the framing that was expected from our hypothesis about party ideology. When we look at our first hypothesis, Democratic presidents will use a liberal frame when discussing their military interventions, we could see that from the 5 Democratic presidents, we could confirm our hypothesis twice and reject it 3 times. Therefore, we can reject H1. We'll use a realist frame when discussing their military interventions. From the 5 Republican presidents the United States had during our research period, our hypothesis is confirmed 2 times and rejected 3 times as well. Therefore, we can conclude we can also reject H2. There are 2 possible answers to why we cannot confirm our hypotheses. One of the possible explanations for the rejection could be because of the unspoken commitment to certain values ingrained to the political party the president belongs to. It could be argued there's no need for a Democratic president to mention typical liberal keywords because it is already understood he adheres to these values. He might, on the other hand, need to ensure it becomes clear he also stands strong on the keywords used by the other side of the political spectrum, such as national interests, investments, etc. One could argue that even though a Republican president might wage a war for reasons of national interest, he chooses to frame it towards the public in terms of peace or humanitarian aid, because it is better for his image to also mention these issues. Another possible road for further research is to look at historical conditions that affect the frames in combination with party identification. With national security frames being more commonly used during the Cold War and the frames around humanitarian help becoming more prevalent since the 1990s, further research should look for period effects and other alternative explanations. American presidents use public discourse to create images for the public to identify and construct the adversaries America faces prior and during armed interventions. There's been much research into the words used by U.S. presidents and the power these words have. This study has tried to answer the following research question. Can the party identification of a U.S. president be linked to a liberal or realist frame in the discourse on military interventions? As we have seen today, we cannot positively confirm that question at this point in time. As a result, we suggest there's plenty to be discovered about the presidential discourse and foreign policy of the United States, especially when it comes to decisions about military interventions. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer all of your questions and comments.